There is a lot in this world that we must accept at face value. We do not often get the chance to lift the lid and take a look at what is really happening, but we are surrounded by great mysteries, confusing creatures, and strange inhabitants, all of whom choosing to disclose as much or as little as they desire. This leaves us with no choice but to pick up the pieces and try to make sense of it all, or live on in constant ignorance. One question which keeps me up at night is the true origin of the screaming antelope and their unusual behaviour. The white lion, although strange in its own right, does not strike me as wholly unnatural. There are whispers it has origins in the Holy Lands, and it could very well be an uncorrupted beast, but looking at the antelope, understanding their behaviour, their anatomy, it is much harder to accept that this creature came into existence without some cruel, higher power's intervention. If there was any sign of a god in this world, then perhaps we might point to the antelope as one of its most obvious creations. And what a malevolent god it must be to deal such a tragic hand. You've already heard all we can gather from our observations, so take anything beyond this point as wild speculation, one theory from a sea of thousands. But we would not talk of these ideas if there wasn't at least some evidence to back it up. So let us explore the idea of the antelope as a creature corrupted, manipulated by chance or by choice into the being you see today. Let us consider the idea that the antelope is infected with the parasite, which is leeching its life force. We should look closely at its second heart, an organ I believe to be that exact parasite, and discuss the damage it causes to the antelope's body. We will also explain how the antelope survives this damage and infection through its constant consumption of Acanthus, before revealing the consequences of that survival, which results in a never-ending spiral of pain and regeneration. But before we reach the very heart of the matter, what other signs are there of a parasite? Many will point to the antelope's peculiar rows of hands on its underside, a similar display which has been seen on the phoenix and other creatures of the world. Whilst we can't dismiss this idea, there is something to question about the fact that no other beast exhibits the same impossible and tragic traits as the antelope. Many exhibit their own unique and strange qualities, but the hands which are ever present throughout this world do not seem to be either the cause or have obvious consequence with regard to the antelope's suffering. So although it has to be mentioned, how much we should rely on this as evidence when considering this particular parasite is up to you. The main argument comes as we take a step further in and talk of the second heart, an organ with a mouth and teeth of its own. Immediately, we must ask what the purpose of the second heart is, and why the antelope possesses such an organ located within the great cavity of its giant undermaw. The second heart is largely isolated from the antelope's other organs, and instead it seems to sustain itself through the food it consumes within that second mouth, the heart absorbing key nutrients directly before it spits the rest back out. This begins the idea of the heart as a separate entity, and we can really emphasize this by considering the stories of survivors who have managed to escape the antelope's insides. They have, on rare occasion, claimed the second heart as a prize, and even outside of the antelope's body, it continues to beat and bite. Although causing some harm to the antelope on the way out, the great beast also appears to continue on, largely unaffected by the loss of this heart, stressing that these are two separate entities, capable of living without the other. In this light, with an isolated organ capable of surviving on its own and causing no negative consequences when removed, there is already a strong argument that says this heart is not natural and did not originate within the antelope. After all, what creature can so readily dispose of a heart with so little consequence? And we can further this argument that the heart originates outside of the antelope by spending enough time on their trail. Pay close attention and you'll come to understand the sickness and decay which permeates their existence. The heart offers a way of explaining this sickness if we consider it as a foreign body, almost like an organ transplant. Even between the same species, biology is a fickle beast, and taking something the size of a heart and placing it inside the antelope would send its immune system crazy, as if in a permanent state of infection and sickness. As such, this could establish a clear connection between the nature and reality of the antelope as we see them and the presence of this second living heart. Why then, if the heart causes such chaos within the antelope's biology, do they continue to live and live in great number? To explain that, we only need to look to their diet. Their obsessive consumption of the Acanthus plants, known for their restorative properties, is the sole reason they are able to survive, as they are constantly rejuvenated. One might argue that the parasite would not want to create and live within a hostile environment, but for the second heart, this is not an issue it needs to solve, as the Acanthus continually restoring the antelope achieves this by natural means. This is what makes the antelope the perfect host. We might speculate here that the second heart being a parasite can also explain the presence and purpose of the giant mouth. Assuming all antelope are infected with the same parasite, then we may assume, in the other direction, that these parasites exclusively infect antelope. In doing so, they're able to manipulate the antelope's biology, creating this second mouth in order to have a means of eating. Unlike a parasite that feeds directly from its host, the mouth of the heart implies it needs to consume the food itself, and creating the second mouth would be the means by which to achieve this. So we now know of the heart's existence as a separate being, living within the antelope. We know how it survives, and the impact it has on the antelope's biology, and why the antelope is able to avoid death despite the rampant internal destruction. We don't know how the antelope became infected. We may attribute it to the work of the hand, or even to natural means, but ultimately, it's not important. What I would like to do is take a step further and consider the impact of the constant restoration of its body, as I think this gives us the final convincing piece we need to really believe in this idea. Imagine for one moment this were a human with a parasitic infection. Without treatment, the human body would combat this at first in fever and sickness, before it started to lose strength and its muscles began wasting away. Its organs would fail and then shut down. The mind would become delirious, then ultimately, the person would die. Now consider what this sickness and decay does to the antelope's body. Even our natural means of regeneration are plagued with potential cancer, and the antelope is operating on a supercharged timescale. As it falls further into sickness, the regular forced rejuvenation would result in cancerous tumours throughout the entirety of its body. At this point, you may be imagining the previous description of the gregalope, and this is no coincidence. In this way, the heart may also offer explanation for the consistent findings of vomit-covered plains and the toxic dung. As the internal conflict worsens, the antelope's other organs would slowly fail and shut down, and their restoration would slip further and further from their starting point with every iteration, causing the organs to stop functioning correctly, if at all. All of these factors likely contribute to the beast's madness, especially if these cancerous tumours and growths also occur within the antelope's brain. But even at the most relatable level, one can assume they are always starving, with the second mouth doing a large portion of the eating, and then what food the antelope does eat simply being thrown back up. It would likely never satiate its hunger fully. With many years of failed hunts, we all know what hunger can do to someone, and despite this hunger, as the antelope's body consumes itself inside out, the antelope will simply survive and heal, living through that same pain, day after day. And returning once more to the notion of the heart being the cause of the stomach opening up, this process most certainly is one of intense pain and suffering. Even the notion of growing those giant teeth is unbearable to think of. And the empty void they open up to? What's truly left of the antelope after this long process? But even still, they do not die because their eternal hunger drives them to eat, and thus the cycle continues. But this is as far as our theory can take us at this point. There is good reason to believe the heart's origin is not natural to the antelope, that it is a separate entity capable of existing externally, but requiring the antelope as a host to travel around and find food and sustenance. There is also reason to believe that this heart is physically harming the antelope and responsible for both its madness and its long-term sickness. All of this points to the heart as a parasite, leeching off the screaming antelope and causing intense pain as it does. So the next time you find yourself gobbled up, why not do yourself and the antelope a favour and cut that second heart loose?